Thank you for coming and welcome. I'm Jeff Colgan. I'm the director of the Climate Solutions Lab. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you Robinson Meyer, who is here to give us a talk about Bidenomics and climate politics in America. Let me just say a few things about his bio, right? So he is the founding executive editor of Heatmap, which is a new media company that's focused entirely on climate change. But he also is a contributing opinion writer at a news outlet you might have heard of, the New York Times, and his previous job was at The Atlantic, where he's covered climate change, technology, and a whole series of other issues as well. I think of Rob Meyer as most news articles that I read because of the headline, not the byline. But when Rob Meyer's in the byline, then I feel like I should really read the article if I possibly can, because I so consistently learn something new from his writing. He's really that thoughtful. The other thing that I want to emphasize about his bio, particularly for all of the undergrad students in the room and those who are getting lunch outside as well, and those who are live streaming for that matter, is that Rob's undergraduate degree is in music. And this is really important because I feel like there are so many undergraduates on campus who are sort of obsessing about which concentration they should have. And Rob is one of many, many examples who go on to do something really great in their career that has almost nothing to do with their undergraduate concentration. And so that is another feature of his bio. But without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to Robinson Meyer. He's going to talk for, say, 40 minutes or so, and then we're going to have Q&A from everyone. Thanks so much. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Jeff. And thank you to Brown for inviting me to campus, and to Ali for organizing, and to Jeff again for having me. It's an honor to be here. I've worked with a number of Brown students over my time. As a journalist, I would say that I was telling someone a few hours ago, every impression of Brown that I have is like raised every time I interact with a student. So it's such a pleasure to be here and to talk to talk to everyone. As Jeff mentioned, I am the executive editor of Heatmap News. We're a new climate-focused online magazine covering climate change and energy and the energy transition and everything else, which, by the way, if you've noticed about climate change, it encompasses every issue in the world, for a general interest but very curious audience, so exactly the people in this room. And if you stick around for the end of the talk, I will give you a code that gives you 50% off Heatmap subscription. Other than that, I'm also a contributing writer at the New York Times, and I was a staff writer at The Atlantic for 10 years. Jeff was sizing up the size of my notes and was like, it's going to be a 40-minute talk. 40-minute talk. What is so striking to me about climate change right now is... What's so striking to me about climate change, climate policy, and climate politics in this moment is how weird it is. Something has really changed in climate politics in America. Something has changed compared to when I started covering climate change in 2015. We all know it. And it's also right there to see. In the next 5 years, the federal government is going to spend $60 billion, and I actually think this is a low estimate for various reasons, on clean energy, when during the 20-teens we only spent $22 billion. If you look at private sector investment, you also see this huge acceleration of financing and money and action in clean energy. In the past 2 years, there's been $213 billion of announced investment in basically any part of the climate economy. So this is EVs, batteries, renewables, carbon management, any of that. And if you look, and while that's very impressive that it's just announced investment, if you look at actual investment, in some ways it's actually even more impressive how much it has gone up, because this is like going up in this current interest rate environment. this year there has been $37 billion of actual investment into the climate economy that has flown in, and you can see how, even a few years ago we were looking at $10 billion of investment a year or less. So what has changed? Well, actually, a lot of things have changed, and we're not going to talk about them all of them today. The 1.5C report came out and galvanized a huge public response. The effects of climate change became harder to ignore. Mainstream media and mainstream political coverage were combined in a certain way to make the climate issue highly salient and also very easy for the media to referee in a way that was very, very productive for policy. All of those things changed. We're not going to talk about them today. What I think is the most important change is that the ideas changed. The actual governing ideology and the ideas that policymakers and everyone around policymakers brings to the task of climate policy making changed. At this point, it is like almost a cliche, I think, to say this and to note that there is this new Washington consensus in Washington. This is a new governing ideology, this set of ideas about economics and politics that has supplanted the old one, also called neoliberalism, that saw markets as the ideal way to handle some forms of governance. The president's national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, gave a speech essentially declaring that there was a new Washington consensus in April. The Economist has done a cover story about it. The New York Times has done a lot of stuff about it. You have surely maybe heard about it. But it is a cliche because it is real. It is actually happening. The Biden administration is using a new outlook to govern its domestic and foreign policy, a new theory of how economics and markets and the entire productive and consumptive sector of human life should be governed. Even the president basically says this. He says, the job of his administration is to make capitalism work for people again. The implication is to make capitalism work in democracy again. And while I think this new ideology is primarily among Democrats, it is not just among Democrats. Republicans, after all, helped pass two of the laws that kind of recognize this ideology, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the CHIPS Act. It was a Republican president who initiated our ongoing trade dispute with China and set Operation Warp Speed in motion, which reflects this kind of new way of thinking about the economy and technology. So there is a new set of ideas in Washington, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Because what's striking to me is that while, as I said, there's tons of coverage of those new ideas, the conversation about those new ideas, that new ideology, has happened primarily among economists, kind of para-policy makers, journalists, Fed reporters, national security experts, kind of the normal community of politics and economic knowers. It has happened largely without the participation of, I think, the climate policy making community. In fact, in that way, it's kind of like a synecdoche for all of Biden's agenda, which is completely dominated by climate policy and ideas about how climate policy interfaces with the economy. Like the IRA is his main legislative accomplishment, but it's judged and covered by people who have very little familiarity with the specific problems of climate policy making. And in this new Washington consensus, those of us in climate change, in climate land, let's say, the economists who study it, the environmentalists, the activists, have kind of sat out this new Washington consensus conversation. And I'm going to make an exception here for the political scientists who I actually think played a very big role and who I'm grateful for inviting me to Brown today. But also who I actually do really think informed this. And that's a shame, because what I've seen with a front row seat to this consensus is that this new ideology was profoundly shaped by the problems of climate change. It was really born out of thinking about the particular problems that climate change poses for the United States. It emerged from thinking about how best to manage the energy transition and decarbonization for America as a political unit, as an economic unit, and then finally as a state. Those of us who care about climate change have for years demanded that economists reckon with some of what we understand about climate change. We have sensed that these existing economic ideas, that the kind of orthodoxy about a carbon tax did not fully capture the whole picture. That climate change was a deeper problem than just another pollution that had to be dealt with as an externality. That the economy as a whole, and we're talking about climate change, we're talking about biogeochemical cycles, we're talking about the biggest nutrient cycling and chemical cycling phenomena that happen on Earth. Our entire economy is on loan from ecology at all times, and there's something about economics that just never really recognized that. We felt that, and we felt futile, and we won. The Biden administration, at its highest level of economic policy making, and I think even arguably at foreign policy making, is acutely aware and has tried to reckon with the climate challenge. And that is great. And that is also terrible. Because if we won, that means that everyone who has been trying to get the US to do something about climate change, for however long it has been, bears some responsibility for how those ideas are being used and what they're doing. In fact, I think in some ways the climate community finds itself right now in the position of the tech industry not so long ago. The energy transition we've known for a long time has profound defense security implications. You know, photovoltaic solar panels. The solar panels on the roof of a building near here were incubated in the same Defense Department and Bell Labs R&D ecosystem that gave us semiconductors and the internet. But like the vibes of the climate challenge were so good, and the vision was so good that it was possible to ignore that. Also, we didn't have power. You know, the cause of a habitable planet was so just, so obvious, and so ignored for so long in America that it was possible to kind of look past some of these implications, some of what we were talking about. Well, it's not ignored anymore. And I think my challenge here today is to say, what does that mean for us? What if we keep spinning out these ideas does this mean for us as folks who want to continue to see climate action and want to continue to see policymakers at every level of the government think about climate action in the way we are? And by the way, you know, even if Trump wins next year, the ideas I think we're going to talk about today will continue to have purchase, both in a GOP administration, because some of these ideas, as we'll see, were very influenced by actions that Trump did, but also because for now, this is the playbook for how American progressives are thinking about climate change at the highest level. So today we're going to lay out some of the big new ideas in this ideology. And I'm going to be in a bit of a risky position because I'm going to be addressing you without the timeliness of being a journalist and without the rigor of being a scholar. It's going to be kind of a vibes-based 30 minutes. You know, normally as journalists, we have a crutch. We're reporters, so we can tell you something new about the world. Hopefully, I will do that here. But if not, please have pity on me. And I hope we start thinking of, I hope it causes you to think. So let's start first with what to call this. You know, at this point, what do we call this new ideology? At this point, like, everyone has offered their own name for this ideology. The Economist calls it Homeland Economics. The Roosevelt Institute, which is a very increasingly influential progressive think tank in DC, calls it a bold new consensus. A different think tank, we won't say whether it's more or less influential than Roosevelt, calls it a new consensus. And the Hewlett Foundation, which has spent tens of millions of dollars trying to create a post-neoliberal consensus in the United States, calls this new idea post-neoliberalism. Which is not a very good name. What I would suggest, I'm not going to name it, but I would suggest that all of the ideas and all of the new ideology kind of clings around this idea of the real economy. At the heart of this ideology is a recognition that the economy is not an abstract entity that needs to be managed primarily with financial tools, but a set of non-fungible goods and services that emerge from specific production methods and labor relations, and that can only be developed through specific financial arrangements. Here's an example. Only COVID-19 vaccines could end the pandemic. That was the only thing that was going to successfully end the pandemic to the degree that it's ended. And only Project Warp Speed, or an effort like it, could develop those vaccines as quickly as they were. That was not an effort where you could look at GDP and say, well, is GDP back or not? We needed a specific non-fungible type of good in order to tackle a very specific problem, and we needed a specific financial arrangement to make it work. To give you another example, only zero carbon forms of energy can fight climate change and the energy transition, and only certain kinds of semiconductors can be made in certain facilities. It is, I think, at the heart of this ideology is a recognition that we live in a world of binding physical constraints, not financial ones. That the actual physical problem of climate change is very, very difficult, and that, on the contrary to, I think, how we used to look at climate change, which is that it would be very expensive, the Keynes line that gets thrown around a lot. Anything we can do, we can afford. So let's talk about a few of the tenets of this new approach. The first one starts where the old consensus leaves off. If you go back and look, so we call it the Washington Consensus because in 1989 or 1990, this economist, John Williamson, gives what is intended to be this entirely descriptive talk in Washington. And he calls it, and basically it's a set of 10 ideas that he says everyone in Washington, but specifically in the World Bank and the IMF, in development-focused banks believe. They wouldn't necessarily all say it in the same way, but they all kind of believe these ideas. And the last, and this is where we get like markets are best unfettered, there's certain things you should, interest rates are best controlled by an independent Fed, all these things that don't really matter for climate policy, but affect for how you think about market governance. And the last point of his Washington Consensus is that secure property rights are actually at the base of any developmental effort. And let's think about that for a second. Basically, if someone violates a contract or someone steals your stuff, you can take them to court in the U.S. And the government will enforce that they make the situation right. Every pro-market reform, John Williamson writes in this very famous speech, depended on this certainty that the U.S. had secure property rights. But property rights were so entrenched in the U.S., he added, that they were, quote, easily overlooked. That they were just this part of the scheme that no one really paid attention to because they're part of the water in the U.S. Well, after the global financial crisis, I think it became impossible to overlook them anymore because of all the ways that what we thought were kind of laws of physics became violated by just what we had to do to save the economy. And during the 2010s as well, a set of antitrust reformers, including some now at the highest levels of the government, began to think about what it would mean if property rights were at the basis of the entire market system. Because the property rights are the basis of the market. And the government is what enforces property rights. Then the government actually is what defines and enforces a market. If you can't have a market without property rights and you need the government to enforce property rights, then there's no market anywhere that exists without a government, especially in the world as we know it. And that means that markets are to some degree the government's handiwork. There's this amazing memo from the Open Markets Institute, which was co-founded by a number of folks, including Lena Khan, the current chair of the Federal Trade Commission, in 2018, where they're protesting the AT&T merger. And they write, there is no such thing as a market, quote, free from government intervention. In fact, government is a precondition for a functioning market. So if markets are basically created by governments, that means that governments have some responsibility for them, at least the responsibility of a parent, right? They have the responsibility, they have the ability, because they made the market in the first place, the right, and actually the duty, like a fiduciary duty, to shape the market. Everything this isn't about climate change, but kind of every other idea follows from this. Idea 2. It's fairly well known at this point that BP, British Petroleum, you've probably seen this on like a meme on Instagram, invented the term carbon footprint in 2004 to allegedly push responsibility for climate change onto individuals, to make it feel like climate change was not a systematic problem, but that it was your personal responsibility to solve. You were in charge of lowering your carbon footprint. And throughout the 2010s, after the failure of Waxman-Markey, the Obama-era climate bill, I think people started to look to think about what this would mean. They said, you know, a common refrain became, don't worry about individual action, because systematic change is all that matters. Right? There's so little that each of us can do to fight climate change while we go about our lives that we're basically compelled to live for lots of reasons. You can kind of trim, carbon emissions from that, but to some degree, carbon emissions are a function of the system that you're in. You know, even bananas, right, when you buy them at the grocery store, only ripen because of the presence of ethylene, which is a petroleum product. Like, it's ethylene gas, a petroleum product. That's the only reason you ever buy ripe bananas at the grocery store. And I don't mean to say that like bananas will be impossible to have in decarbonization. I mean to say that that is an example of how you can be really careful, but every single choice you make, you are enmeshed in a world where where fossil fuels and fossil fuel products are part of the economy. And so you began to be this idea, that carbon can only be managed kind of almost like we manage other parts of the economy, right? Because here's this system, right? There's millions of debits and credits to the carbon cycle every day. Whenever you turn on your car, you're like adding carbon, or you take it out of the ground. It's a huge, disparate system. And it's vast and interconnected. And so the only way to do it would be to like treat it as like an exponent of the economy. And at the same time in the 2010s, there was a rising frustration and despair about the political prospects for what I would call the standard economic tools of climate policy. These are your carbon tax, your cap and trade. After the Yellow Vest protests in France over higher fuel taxes, and I think especially after voters in Washington state during the Trump administration in back-to-back years rejected carbon tax proposals by referendum, advocates began to ask whether high salience, big policies that would raise fossil fuel prices could ever work. So far we've only been successful at decarbonizing the one sector of the economy where there's the power sector, where cheap or low cost substitutes are easily available. Once wind and solar began to be cost competitive, then the whole game changed. And so there's a recognition, I think, at the heart of this ideology, and you can see it in the IRA, you can see it in, honestly, the bipartisan infrastructure law, that the climate problem arises from the economy as a whole, and a country's carbon intensity is as core an attribute as its GDP or productivity. And what that means is that its carbon intensity must be dealt with at that systematic economic national level. The third idea is the idea that economic elegance and proper market function are secondary to political expediency. Well, how do we know that everyone who's a policymaker believes in this? Just look at all the markets that they've been willing to intervene in since the pandemic happened. But what does this idea mean? I think there's two actual different versions of this idea floating around Washington, and there's a vulgar one and let's say a more capacious one. The vulgar one is a very pragmatic politics of strategic moderation. And it says, well, look, Democrats are the only political party that wants to fight climate change. Climate progress depends on Democrats, therefore, winning elections. To win elections, Democrats need to be popular, and therefore they should not be afraid of making some short-term compromises on climate change in pursuit of political victory, because Democrats need to stay in office to manage the ongoing transition. Those arguments were particularly popular when Biden was looking to cut gasoline prices immediately after the Ukraine invasion. But there's a more capacious version too, and in some ways I think the more capacious version is more important. And that's people shouldn't overcomplicate things in the name of a kind of theoretical economic elegance. Jen Harris, who used to work on climate, then went into work in the National Security Council in the White House, once said at a Roosevelt Institute event, the marginal efficiency of something that's dead in the water, the marginal efficiency of something that's politically dead in the water is zero. And that represents a big change from the Obama administration, which on healthcare, but especially on climate, was willing to absolutely stretch the limits of legality in order to create the most elegant and cheapest market solution it can. You know, the EPA, the Clean Power Plan, did all these things that, honestly, if you're going to ask some progressive regulatory people, they would say really bent what the Clean Air Act allowed in order to create a very cheap energy transition. By rejecting those tools, and of course the Supreme Court then said you also can't use these, they are illegal, Biden has been able to drive more carbon out of the power grid by using actually much more simpler regulatory tools that will be more expensive. They're still, their benefits still exceed their costs, but they're much less expensive than, they're much more expensive than the Obama rules. The third idea is about this idea called the value chain. The value chain begins to be an idea in kind of business in 1985. There's a book by a man named Michael Porter called Competitive Advantage, and he defines the value chain as a set of activities that an organization carries out to create values for its customers. Well, I think there was a rising recognition among policymakers, and you can see this in Jake Sullivan's writing, that since the 70s, the US has focused way too much on the top and the bottom of the value chain for goods. We make a lot of commodities, we make a lot of corn, and then we make like the absolute highest thing. In some ways, think about like your iPhone, right? Designed by Apple in California, assembled in China. Some of the world's best physical products are conceived, financed, programmed, and advertised in the United States, but they're made elsewhere. And there was a recognition among policymakers that this was an unsustainable position, especially in the green transition, when the energy industry as a whole is moving from being a commodity-based business, right? You take oil out of the ground, then you refine it, then you sell that relatively low value-add good, or I mean, you add that relatively rudimentary good to a very high value-add business because everything that generates energy in a renewables or clean energy economy is a manufactured product, right? A solar panel, a wind turbine, these are manufactured products. That countries, I think policymakers realize that countries that specialize, that the US specialty of focusing on the bottom and the top was unsustainable because lots of countries focus on the middle, and the middle is where a lot of the value add happens. And that value add may not show up on the books, but those countries in the middle are constantly clamoring to move up and to move up the value chain further. And with their know-how, we'll get to that in a second, but with their know-how, their actual understanding of how actual objects, right, specific objects are moving down specific production lines and are specifically mass-produced, they will eventually be able to produce a competitive product to the US. That the US dominance at the top was completely unsustainable. That's why the CHIPS Act and the IRA both try to reshore manufacturing in certain industries. And that's important because there was a matching recognition that the US crisis, the American crisis, is a stuff crisis. It is a crisis caused by acute shortages and acute lacks of certain things, right? Housing, certain kinds of infrastructure, certain kinds of energy production, and that the US needs to overhaul its physical infrastructure in order to meet its goals. It's not a welfare problem necessarily, it's a physical crisis. There's many, many examples of this. You can look at Ezra Klein's abundance agenda with Derek Thompson. You can look at simply the fact that the bipartisan infrastructure law passed last year. What I would highlight here is that this, I think, is a real wager among policymakers that simply by fixing the material problems that ail American life, they can deal with the problems of Trumpism and the problems of the center not holding. And if Trumpism is primarily, or right-wing populism, whatever you want to call it, is primarily a post-material effect. It's actually that people are now very wealthy, and so they don't care about these kind of basic issues as much and are willing to kind of use politics as an expressive venue, then the American crisis being a stuff crisis may be a very interesting problem, but it won't actually be relevant. Next idea. Policy can accelerate technology development. Well, we've actually just seen a huge example of that, right, in Operation Warp Speed. But we've also seen it in the wind, solar, and battery miracle. I meant to put charts in here, but I'm sure you've seen them. Over the past 20 years, the cost of wind, but especially of solar and battery, has fallen dramatically. And as we've gotten good at making more solar panels and more batteries, specifically as China has gotten good at making more solar panels and more batteries, it has gotten very, very good at bringing down their price. And not only have those that, kind of brought down the cost of this thing that we want to do, but that's the only reason, as I was saying earlier, that we've achieved decarbonization. And so once you start bringing down the cost of these technologies, you can get a vortex going where your policy drives down the cost of technology. The lower technology means you deploy more of that technology. That means businesses start to develop an interest in it. Then those businesses fight for more aggressive technology. This, I think, is the next idea, that this green vortex is the proper aim of climate policy in the US. Because, as many folks in this room know, the US, although it has contributed to the largest share of historical emissions, in terms of climate change as a future-looking issue, the US will not dominate the rest of the 21st century. It will primarily be a Chinese, Indian, Indonesian, and start moving down the BRICS list after that issue. That's where most of the future emissions are coming from. And if those countries develop in a way that's very fossil fuel intensive, that's actually what's going to knock the world into 2+C pathways. And so, well, let's keep thinking about that. If the US isn't responsible for the upcoming lion's share of emissions, obviously we have this historical responsibility, but if we're not responsible for the upcoming share of emissions, well, what is the role of the US in a global decarbonization system? I think the response among policymakers has been that the US is the R&D lab of the world. We are like the first place you deploy certain kinds of technologies. I was recently in Germany, and in Germany they have these incredible windows. I'm not sure if you've ever seen them. They are tilt-turn windows. You can open them from the side, but you can also open them from the top, so you can vent air. The Germans are like obsessed with ventilation, and I was talking to a German person about these windows. I was like, these windows are so amazing. And the German I was talking to was like, well, what are your windows like in America? And I said, I don't know. There's like a bottom pane and a top pane. And he goes, you mean the windows you open like this? And I was like, yes. And he went, just like in the movies? This is the role of the US in the world, right? Our patterns of development have patterned how the rest of the world understands development. And I think there's a recognition among policymakers, well, how can that be turned to climate change? Another example here that I think is quite relevant. Denmark, in the 1970s, there was an energy crisis. Every country in the world kind of looked inward, and said, oh, no, we can't be reliant on the world for our energy supplies. How can we inshore? How can we cause as much of our energy supplies to come from inside as possible? That's why the US then actually really ramped up the amount of coal it was burning in response to the crisis, because we had a lot of coal. That's why the French invested in the nuclear industry. In Denmark, very small country, very resource poor. And they said, well, what can we do? How can we ensure our energy production? Well, what Denmark did have was a tremendous shipbuilding industry at the time. And they said, how can we take this expertise that we already have and direct it towards something that will be energy generating? And Denmark then, actually through a kind of accidental collaboration with the state of California, wound up basically creating the modern wind industry through its expertise that it already had in shipbuilding. So the US is the second largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world, don't get me wrong. We have to reduce our own emissions. But by reducing our own emissions, we'll reduce the world's emissions as well. And in fact, the biggest thing we can do to fight global climate change is to cut these premiums that make the green substitute more expensive than fossil fuels. The next idea, it's funny, I was just talking to Jeff about this, is that the United States has as much right to compete in the global economy as any other country. This has some nerve-wracking implications. After Trumpism, elites looked at the working class population in the US and they said, well, how did this Trump disaster happen? And one of the answers that was given, this very material answer, was deindustrialization, right? The forgotten communities in the Rust Belt. As folks looked around, they said, actually, the rest of the world doesn't have these problems. Other developed countries don't necessarily have these problems. In Germany or South Korea or Taiwan or Japan, there's actually plenty of industrial activity still happening. There's plenty of high-value manufacturing. So what can we do to, like, participate in that too? Because, by the way, the whole edifice of the global economy rests basically, as Jeff has observed, on peaceful domestic U.S. politics. And so we actually have to do what we can to preserve peaceful U.S. domestic politics, or the whole rules-based order will fall down for the U.S. And that's what spurred, I think, the current Biden policymaker, but also on the right as well, this interest in industrial policy. You can hear Marco Rubio castigate policymakers of the 90s and the aughts for sending away manufacturing, that this weakened our industrial base. It's the same rhetoric. Now, what's so unprecedented at this moment, as Jonas Nahm, who's a researcher at SAIS, professor at SAIS, has observed to me, is that normally industrial policy of the type that has kept industry in South Korea, Japan, Germany, is like a real specific thing. It's really related to what that country needed to do at its own historical moment. But now, because of climate change, everyone is pursuing it at once. And we've never had a moment where everyone is trying to do industrial policy at the same time, except maybe, depending on which scholars you read, maybe the 1930s, which is not a very heartening example either. So Jonas observed that to me, and as if to demonstrate how starved for industrial policy talent the government is, Jonas now works in the White House advising the Council of Economic Advisors on this exact problem, which is how are we going to deal with the fact that everyone has passed industrial policy at the same time. There's a few more ideas that specifically have to do with climate change. The first is that and the big one is that climate change is about tail risk. So what is tail risk? Well, look at this chart. This chart was created by Martin Weitzman, who's a underappreciated economist of climate change. In fact, I think the most influential now economist of climate change and how actual policymakers are actually thinking about climate change. And he said, look, if you were to emit enough CO2 as the IPCC, to raise global atmospheric level to 700 ppm. They're at 420 or so right now. As you can see, the IPCC would describe this as being, roughly that's like a 2.9 C global temperature rise. They'd say the odds are if you emit that much CO2 in the atmosphere, we'll get, roughly 3 C of global temperature rise on average. But Martin Weissman was like, look, that is actually the reflection. We talk about these temperature averages. That is the reflection of a probability, of a bell curve. And there's like approximately a slightly less than 10% chance that if you emit that much CO2, you won't get a 3C reaction from the climate system. You'll get a 6C or more, which is like 10 degrees Fahrenheit or more reaction from the climate system. That our understanding of the climate system is probabilistic. And therefore, when we talk about these, like, oh, we're aiming for 2C, we're actually aiming to put the amount of carbon in the air that we think will produce a 2C outcome. And that we needed to be aware that there's a chance it could produce this tail risk, right? This risk all the way out there, which would be a catastrophic risk. That's like end of society risk. 6C plus, nobody talks about how bad that would be, right? So that recognition of the role of tail risks means that you basically need to start cutting tons as soon as you can, and that every ton matters. But also that you needed to think about climate change not as a problem of an externality, right, where you were aiming for emissions reductions, the cheapest emissions reductions over time. You're aiming for the most feasible emissions reductions over time, and you're not even really aiming for emissions reductions, you're aiming for decarbonization. You are trying to create a zero carbon energy system as fast as you can, because the risks are so huge. That understanding, if you compare it to the one where I think the more traditional economic understanding of climate change, where carbon is a involves trade-offs, right? You want to develop, so you want to emit, but you also don't want to like make the world too bad, so you don't want to emit, and so that means you need to put a price on carbon, and then every individual actor will like judge whether they want to like pay that social cost of carbon whenever they burn fossil fuels as like input into the price information, and therefore will arrive at the optimal version of climate, like will arrive at an optimal warming outcome. That is like all built into the Nordhausian way of thinking about climate change. The Whitesian version says, no, it's about tail risk, and we actually want to cut as much carbon in as feasible a way as we can, as fast as we can, because the catastrophic risk is so big. And that catastrophic risk will be so expensive that dealing with it, getting it out of the way, pays for the whole thing. So those are a couple of the ideas at the heart of this new consensus. And I have kind of want to first challenge you to say, what does that mean for us, right? What does this set of ideas mean if we recognize the fact that American policymakers, who control an enormous amount of firepower, influence in the world, they're not the only ones, but they are very powerful, believe this set of ideas? I actually don't know, but I think I have 3 observations. The first is how weird it is we got here, but also how contingent. Because so many of Biden's achievements could not have happened if they didn't follow the pandemic or precedents set by former President Donald Trump, right? If not for Trump's trade policy, then Biden wouldn't have as easily tossed aside the World Trade Organization's rules that would otherwise prohibit our IRA subsidies. If not for the pandemic-era recovery bills, Congress would not have felt as comfortable spending hundreds of billions of dollars on climate, clean energy, or infrastructure. If not for Operation Warp Speed, Democrats wouldn't have focused and wouldn't have trusted as completely in the ability of policy to drive down or constrain technological innovation. And that's a tendency you actually see kind of everywhere in democratic thinking nowadays. It's not just in their climate policy, it's also in basically their entire China policy too. And finally, if Trump hadn't used the Defense Production Act so aggressively to speed vaccine production, then Democrats wouldn't have been so comfortable using it to bring down inflation in 2021 and 2022. The second idea here is that all these ideas are very important. I think they're very, I'm talking about them in primarily a descriptive way, but I think they have brought about policy change. And what those policy changes mean is that we are back in a world where personal action actually does begin to matter more. And that's because for a while we were able to say, that doesn't matter compared to systematic change. The apotheosis of this statistic, right, is that 100 corporations are responsible for 71% of emissions since 1988. But those corporations are responsible for emissions because they're supplying fossil fuels to us, who then do things with them in our lives. And now that the IRA and other policy will help bring down the cost of those substitutes, those things where we don't need fossil fuels to do certain things we want to do in our life, we actually do need to choose those substitutes. We need Americans to choose these technologies. And while the subsidies are going to make EVs and clean electricity and heat pumps cost competitive or cheap, they're not going to force people to choose them. And so we have now enabled personal action, but we have not forced it. And that means that until we have some kind of forcing function in the world, it is actually quite important that we don't blame this on oil companies as much, but look for options where low cost and substitutes are available and we can choose them. And finally, that institutions matter again. Institutions are looked at as, in this new worldview, as extremely important. There's an understanding among policymakers that some institutions, like, say, the Fed, were very successful in upholding their mandate and their role during the pandemic, and some, like the CDC, were not. That has produced a kind of realization that we should care about institutional cultures. The most robust version of this is that I've actually heard the SEIU, the Service Employees Union, chief economists say that you can solve the Hayekian information problem. That is, you can contain all the information that would otherwise be contained in prices by simply having very good institutions. But if Todd Tucker, who's an economist at the Roosevelt Foundation, said to me the U.S. kind of by entering a developmental state approach again is discovering what developmental economists have always known, which is that institutions matter. And it will matter who works in those institutions, how they comport themselves, how those institutions understand their goals, the freedom that they're given to understand their goals, and the actions of people once you put them in charge of those enabled institutions. And what that means is actually something that I think in progressive politics folks don't always think about anymore, which is if institutions matter, which means that institutional leaders matter, then personality matters. And the moral rectitude, the people you put in charge of those institutions matter. We believe at this point that the recognition among policymakers now is that institutions are the only way, better institutions are the only way to defeat climate change and the climate problem. But that means that we're going to have to focus on eventually something that I think we ignore when we talk about all the structural drivers of politics, which is the people in charge of those institutions that we create will matter very much. Thank you so much, and thanks for having me. And let me see if I have, here we go. Heatmap.news, heatmap.news. Enter it into your browser, heatmap.news, and if you use the promo code, all caps, Brown50, Brown50, I feel like I'm on a podcast, then you can get 50% off. And we'd love to have you as a reader.
Fantastic. Rob, thank you so much for this talk. Just wonderful. We are going to have an opportunity to ask questions. And I don't know about you, but I was taking notes, and my mind is a whirl with many questions. And so I will abuse the position of being chair to ask the first one, and then I will open it up to you. I want to take us back to the start of your talk, where you very wisely said, listen, there are a number of things that have changed in climate politics, and I want to talk about the ideas, but there are some other things that I won't talk about. And so I want to focus in on one of the ones that you mentioned, which is the media's ability to referee climate politics, which you said had suddenly increased in the last few years. And since you are embedded in the media industry, I wonder if you could just say more about that, because it is notable in a time when, outside of climate politics, in democratic politics more broadly, I think the media has struggled considerably with any kind of refereeing, fact-checking, truth-telling, etc. And so what did you mean specifically by that? What changed and what enhanced the media's ability to do that?
Yeah, I think it was actually like a very specific, do I need to push?
Can we hear
Rob
at the back?
Great. Okay, great.
Yeah, okay.
I think it was a really specific set of constraints, set of situation that existed in the media, I would say almost after the 1.5C report, and that specifically exists around climate change. Because for a long time, the U.S. was in the position of, number one, not doing anything about climate change, but number two, having climate change be an established scientific fact. And that meant that reporters and journalists, even objective, not opinion magazine-y writers like me, but objective reporters were like given some latitude by editors to editorialize on these topics in the stories, in the objective stories themselves. That they could say the U.S. still hasn't done anything, that there was an ability to kind of cascade it free because it was a national failing, and also because it was so clearly established, right? That the metrics on getting to zero carbon energy system are so clear that it was very easy to referee. And so after there was that intensification of climate activism and of public concern after the 1.5C report, which I think really does have like a determinative role in all of this, the media, and specifically like the not climate media, but like broadcast news, was able to talk about the scientifically demonstrated need for some form of climate policy, and was able to really referee when Democrats failed, and Republicans too, but when Democrats, who are the party allegedly of doing something about climate change, failed to do anything about climate change. And so, unlike healthcare, where there's a very complicated, not only set of policies, but set of like goals you might want to accomplish, climate policy was so modal when we had very little of it, that you could simply be like, Biden came in and said he was going to do something on climate, and now he's not, and here are activists to talk about it. But the media could really, the Chuck Todds of the world could really hammer Democrats over that failure, and it was such a demonstrably clear failure. And one where I also think the media could do what the media is always eager to do, which is antagonize Democrats in a way that reflects their own objectivity well.
Okay. Wonderful. I'm opening up the floor to anyone who has questions. Please, Dina.
Hi. So I went to another talk recently with a woman who works in climate tech venture capital, and she said that when she looks at like picking investments in these like green technologies that you were talking about that will like accelerate decarbonization, she doesn't take the IRA into account at all, because she thinks that like it's like pretty volatile, and like she doesn't trust that it will still be there. And so like in the context of this new ideology, excuse me, that you're talking about, if like Republicans win the next presidential election, what do you think the IRA will be overturned, and like what do you think will happen to the new ideology?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think Eva's referring to Sophie Purdom, who was with us last week. So, and I know you know her.
I know
her,
Sophie.
So, there you go. So.
Sophie's great. Well, I would say first, if I were a venture capitalist picking companies for clients who were looking to increase their wealth by investing in early stage companies, I think that would be a very natural decision to make, because you want to look for the best bets, and the best bets are not going to be policy dependent. And so I understand why. I think to some degree, almost regardless of what political determination you would make about the stickiness of the IRA, that would be a very natural choice you would make if you were actually doing asset allocation around the green transition in the United States. That being said, to actually answer the question, I don't know, but I think a few things. The first is I don't know whether Republicans will repeal the IRA or not. I think they will find it very hard to repeal the IRA because they have created, because first of all, it will score as raising taxes. Now, we can talk about whether it's actually going to be rhetoric as raising taxes, but it will look like they're raising tax. That's actually what it will appear to be. Second of all, even if you put that aside, companies are very eager about these subsidies. And they're very eager about the subsidies and the tax credits in the IRA, and they're directing investment planning on those subsidies. And VCs may not be, but GM, Ford, the big hydrogen companies, even the oil majors absolutely are. And I think because of that, if a Republican majority were to come into office, if repealing the IRA was its number one priority, then I could maybe see it, but I think that's probably unlikely. I think they'll have other priorities, in which case I think it would be those companies are going to turn on their full lobbying apparatuses and protect the IRA. And voters will be much easier to mobilize around the IRA then too, because it will be something that's going away rather than something that's being added. I think that if I had to bet on the most likely outcome under a Republican administration, it's that some programs do get repealed or cut back. Some programs that never get repealed never get implemented, but that other programs, simply because they're so remunerative for fossil fuel companies that know, regardless of what happens in the late 2020s, that in the 2030s, 2040s, and 2050s, they're going to be facing some kind of regulation, will want to keep other programs and other tax credits intact, simply because they'll be so profitable for them.
Great.
That could be wrong, though. I just think it's like the ACA, example is the Obamacare example is so instructive.
Steve.
Well, thanks. That was a great talk, and thank you for mentioning biogeochemistry in the Watson Institute. One of the few. Yeah. Very happy about that. So I guess my question is about how you would give this talk at a what you perceive as a more conservative institution. Because I feel like this talk is predicated on the idea, this consensus is speaking to half or so of the country. And I think it's fair to say you made an assumption about the audience that you were going to speak to. And would you say the same things about consensus, about climate reporting, about the media fact checking, if you were speaking at a place that you presume to have different politics?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I know this is being recorded, so I think, well, first of all, I would say that while I was thinking about the talk, I was like, who is the we of this talk?
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm asking.
Yeah, and I think the we of the talk is like we who want to do something about climate change, which is like the usual we in my story. So it's like a liberal we, but it's not, but like in the European sense maybe, and not, I guess what I'd say is that would I give a different talk to a conservative or institution? I might. Though I do think that if you look at what the rising star Republican senators talk like, it's a lot of similar rhetoric. It's a lot of rhetoric about how manufacturing matters, how you can't offshore, how it actually matters to make things, now, and actually this goes back to the IRA question, I think those senators also talk about how the IRA and the Biden climate policies are job killing. And job killing, right, has been like the number one criticism brought against climate policies for 30 years, or a very high criticism brought against climate policies for a long time. And I do think that that's eventually going to cause a crisis when they're making policy, because there will be jobs dependent on some of those programs, and they will be the ones then killing jobs. In fact, the whole architecture of democratic climate policy, the whole architecture of the IRA now is meant to generate jobs, maybe a lot of inefficient jobs, frankly, and that will make repealing it harder. But would I give a different talk? I would probably give a talk about the similarities between how Republicans and how Democrats are kind of thinking about the set of issues and some of the crises that could emerge, tensions that could emerge from that. But I don't think that the set of ideas I discussed in the talk are limited just to progressives or less just to Democrats. I think it's kind of like a nascent groping towards something new on both sides.
Could you mentioned institutions matter. I'm a former APA staffer, so I totally agree with that. Can you develop that idea a little more? Because Trump has made no secret of his interest in dismantling the administrative state, as have Mitch McConnell and other Republicans. Getting rid of the Administrative Procedures Act, getting rid of the Senior Executive Service, and Heritage Foundation is working with them on putting that together in the second term, regardless of what Republican emerges from the primary. So can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I know that one of the beauties in terms of policy with the tax credit is that it requires very little administrative oversight. It's really self-operating.
Right, exactly. So I guess I would say that I think the Heritage, where I think there's a lot of contradiction here is in what Trump wants to come in and do to the regulatory state. Although, well, I'm not, this is the contradictions involved in the entire Republican agenda, is they say they want to do thing A, B, and C, but you need certain kinds of institutions to do those things. They also need policy-making talent, where I think about institutions mattering is actually less on the governmental side. There's this idea called, we talked a little bit about know-how in the talk. there's this idea that's basically that social anthropologists call tacit knowledge, which is things that you know that you would struggle to write down in a book, right? If you think if you think there's like a leaky faucet in your house or like a toilet that flushes weird, if you had to describe could you write an account of how to, like in a book, could you write down how to flush the toilet or like turn off the leaky faucet? Probably not. But if you were someone were like standing there looking at you, you'd be like, you got to do like, this thing and like pull it up a little bit at the end. That is called know-how. And I think one big idea that I didn't get to in the talk is like know-how tends to reside in institutions, and it resides in institutions at every level. It's at the labor level, it's at the managerial level, it's at, at the highest goal level. And protecting that know-how is like extremely important. We're seeing it now with chips, right? There's tons of, if you want to build a 3 nanometer semiconductor, which is what the Taiwan, TSMC does, the actual knowledge of how to make a 3 nanometer semiconductor is like in the institution of TSMC. Like it is like in the workers. There are certain steps that have not been necessarily documented, but like the worker who comes into that point of the line every day knows what they need to do or how to operate the machine in a certain way. And this is true like up and down. This is true across lots of sectors. So when I think about institutions mattering, that's what I mean, that there's tacit knowledge in the economy that you can't like alienate away that tacit knowledge, and that institutions like nurture that tacit knowledge over time. They also matter at the governmental level. And it would be bad if the Heritage Foundation were to destroy the civil service. I think that would be bad for the United States, and also bad for lots of Republican governance goals as well.
Yeah, please.
Could you talk a little bit about the effects of dark money and political contributions from the fossil fuel industry?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Timmons is the expert here right behind you. It's very important, although I would also say that at this point, I guess my contrarian take is that dark money, there's also a lot of dark money on the Democratic side too, and that's also bad because while it seems to accomplish progressive goals, I think or point institutions toward progressive goals, it often points institutions to progressive goals with no member supported buy-in and with no checks and balances. And so it can really distort, billionaire dollars can really distort kind of any institution they come into, because your main objective then becomes to keep getting billionaire dollars. That being said, that's really not really about the fossil fuel industry. I think the fossil fuel, I think dark money is very important. It's important on the, it's primarily important on like the side of blocking climate action, right? I mean, it antagonizes against it. I think where I would, and I think like it's important. I guess I don't know what to say beyond that. I guess I'd say two things. I think the first is that I am of the belief that like money in politics doesn't matter for the most high salient issue. It matters for everything else. And so Joe Manchin is the #1 recipient of oil and gas money in Congress. The IRA is a flawed law because he was the 50th vote on it. But the IRA does actually do a lot for decarbonization. And when push came to shove, Manchin being in the position of being the Democrat who was blamed for preventing climate policy did actually kind of lift his opposition to a lot of climate policy. And he did ultimately vote for the IRA, and craft the IRA. I think the second thing is that my maybe political economic take is that dark money is very important for shaping the Republican kind of infrastructure overall, being so tied to the fossil fuel industry. But at the same time, voters who are part of the fossil fuel industry also care about the fossil fuel industry. And they earnestly believe that the fossil fuel industry is important to their livelihoods, and that's not. I mean, that is the result of like political organizing, but it's like a weird. It's a form of organizing that if it were to happen in other parts of society, we'd be like, yes, that's good. And so I guess what I'd say is that, you know, the role of the fossil fuel industry, I think, has been extremely important in fighting off kind of the marginal climate policies and fighting off the big climate policies for a long time. At this point, I think it's important to keeping Republicans so tied to that particular industry and its particular outcomes. But I would add there's a lot of voters who are very polarized by this issue. And and it's not in the coal industry, it's in oil and gas through the South and through the fracking, you know, the Permian and the middle of the country. And, you know, you don't have to work in the fossil fuel industry to think that it's to find it a compelling voting issue. And I guess my view is always like voters at the end of the day are like what matters here. And there are a lot of voters who earnestly believe in the fossil fuel industry.
Kate, please.
Yes, so just a question more on journalism and the transformation of journalism. From your perspective, how has like the digitalization affected the way you report on climate politics and in this kind of post-COVID world?
So I've only ever worked in a kind of post-apocalyptic journalism industry. I started at The Atlantic in 2013. So we, you know, by that point, the kind of big, the huge meteor strike of the global financial crisis had like hit, and some institutions were in growth mode. The Atlantic was one of them, but like we're still hemorrhaging local papers all across the country constantly. Where I mean, frankly, I think like the shift to digital has been bad for most parts of journalism. It was exciting when it was happening, and of course, I work at a reader-supported at an outlet that's trying to be a reader-supported media outlet, and our business model is probably, you know, now we publish a website every day and we ask people to subscribe and we have a paywall. That would have been a magazine if we were doing this 20 years ago. The economics of the magazine would have been way better than the economics of our site. But I think digitalization has like created, from a reader-writer perspective, like the concentration of the media in certain national cities, which then everyone reads because they're like very good outlets and they have the most resources and they do amazing work. Like the New York Times, right, is the classic example. But what that has meant at the same time is that there has been a loss of all these local journalism institutions where other people were doing reporting and where a lot of jobs that are now handled by one person or, you know, let's say 10 people in New York at a variety of outlets used to be handled by 400 people across the country looking at the same sets of beats. And that's been a massive loss. And I don't think nonprofit journalism really addresses it. I'm not very optimistic about it, honestly.
Can I just jump in and say, Rob and I were talking earlier this morning about it, and sort of the one silver lining to local journalism is student journalism.
Yeah,
that
that's
many
right. That's
of
actually correct, yes.
You know, the student campus newspapers are doing some of the best journalism, local journalism in the country.
I want to recognize in the audience Will, who's an awesome, amazing intern for Heatmap over the summer and is now the editor-in-chief of the BDH. So.
Sure. Timmons, you had your hand up, and I don't know if your question got stolen or what you were asking.
You should challenge this fossil fuel thing, because I feel like I'm not...
So I will. You know, some people, my colleague Bob Brule included, would say that public opinion doesn't really matter, that the fossil fuel industry and the right have understood that the focus of their influence campaigns needs to be on decision makers. And they very effectively, you know, have mobilized their fossil fuel CEOs to go in and schmooze with administration officials and the top senators and on down the line. The whole pretense, we had Leah Stokes in here, when? In the spring, talking about the passage of the IRA, right? A political scientist from UC Santa Barbara, who was advising the, Chuck Schumer's staff as they were drafting the IRA. And, the whole idea of is exactly what you're talking about, this sort of green vortex of creating jobs, right? And creating industrial actors or people who become then, who need this to keep going and will mobilize their lobbying machine and influence machine to keep it from being repealed. I think it's still wildly unbalanced that the fossil fuel industry and other entrenched interests, and we have this whole now global network called Climate Social Science Network, 450 scholars around the world, social scientists looking at obstruction, the organizations that are obstructing climate change. That it's everywhere, and these are massive, sets of think tanks, university programs, campaign organizations like Americans for Progress, and there's PR firms, law firms, foundations, and on and on. Anyway, quite a machine that's still going to mobilize and is mobilizing now to undermine the implementation of the IRA and mobilizing to gut the whole thing.
Yes,
And I don't want to be defeatist about this. I just think people need to be
No, I think that's right, but
and mobilize themselves.
I think that's right. I think that I think that basically I have little to add to that analysis. is the main thing. I guess like twofold is that I think the first is that also at UC Santa Barbara, Matt Mildenberger's work on that what was so important in the 90s and the aughts was the double representation of both the executives from fossil fuel companies and that whole complex, as your and Bob Brull's work has shown, and as I've covered your exact work.